Hey everyone, welcome. Come on in and let's talk education, parenting, homeschool, right? Today I want to talk about this topic of let's teach our children to observe. Maybe be observant, but either way, that's the idea. So what is observation? Why is not being able to observe well a problem? What do we do about it? Kind of what we're facing today. Uh, My name is Dr. Fred Ray Lybrand, and we homeschooled our kids from age birth to college. And I can tell you they're all quite observant. And I'm going to show you a little bit of how and why we did it. Here's the problem with observation. So, observation is when you notice something, what you can observe, what you can see. And if a person is not very observant, it generates a bit of a problem, as it were. So, I found this quote of Sherlock Holmes. I have two I want to mention. It goes like this: "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data." That's a big deal. When we come up with theories, like read people's mind, before we have the data, the information, before we've observed what's even in front of us, that gets to be a problem. And the coronavirus days, this was a challenge. People were making guesses and models and all kinds of stuff, and we just didn't have enough data in. We didn't know, so we're coming up with theories about how it's going to go, how it's not going to go, and then we retrofit criticism on everybody for not having the right theory. Well, as Sherlock Holmes says, I'm thinking Arthur Conan Doyle, it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. You can watch our current circus of the media these days and see the exact same thing. That instead of observing what someone's really saying, it's out of context and they got a theory and then the theory proves something. So I want to talk to you about this issue and what to do about it. Let me tell you some practical ways it shows up with our kids. So there can be an area like reading. So what I notice with our kids when they're young and learning to read, and sometimes when kids are older they do this, but they're reading aloud, and instead of reading what's in front of them and like sounding out the words, which is observant, they will actually guess. And it comes out, I have a book here I'm going to read from later, but let me just pick something. She looked at the queen and I can see a kid going, not seem to have suddenly, but let's say see to have suddenly roped herself in a wool. So it's really wrapped herself, but they just guess. And I've watched this for years with kids. That's what they'll do. They'll be reading, and instead of sounding out the word, grandiloquent. Let's pick a hard one. They just make up something. Grand piano, who knows? And they act like that making up something is the answer, but it's not. See, reading requires being observant. You've got to actually observe what the letters are doing in their order, diphthong, sounds, all the rest of that stuff. That's the game. That's the secret. To learn to be fundamentally observant, to not only notice where you are, but know what you're looking at, what you see. Here's another one. Spelling. The problem with spelling is that spellers who are not good do something spellers who are good are consistent with. So good spellers don't ever guess. Bad spellers guess all the time. So they'll guess at how to spell a word and say, close enough. Maybe on a spelling test you have to do that because partial credit or something. But when you're writing, that's not how it works. You don't need to guess at a word, but that's what being unobservant is about. They haven't been observant in looking at the words in the spelling, haven't been observant with even how they might sound it out in spelling, and instead they just make a guess. And a lot of life is that way. It's as Doyle said, or Sherlock Holmes said, it's this game of having a theory, an idea like mind reading or something. And then with that theory in place, we observe what's relevant and dismiss everything else. Really not a good way to go. Not a good way to go at all. We do it with friendships too. A lot of friendships have been destroyed because of this. We're not observant. We have a theory and it makes us miss things, right? So a friend doesn't call you back, or maybe that you say hi to someone and they kind of look at you that way and didn't talk to you. Okay, so if you would be observant, you might notice that that's not their normal behavior. But instead of being observant, you have a theory that they don't like you or they're mad at you about something you've made up. And as a result, you go on in the context and build up your mind that they're bad people. So the next time they say hi to you, you're not nice to them and they think something's weird there. And then they back up, you back up. Next thing you know, your friendship's gone. This kind of stuff happens, honestly, all the time. If you'd been observant, you would have noticed later in the day, they gave the same face. They weren't there. They left early. And then if you'd go find out, which is more observation, you would notice that they had a stomach bug. And all you saw is somebody with stomach pains looking at you and couldn't talk. They were sick, didn't want to spread it. But because you can read minds and because you're not observant, friendships are gone. Fred, it can't be that simple. Yeah, it can. And it is. It's really that way. We're so busy confirming what we assume, we don't observe. We see what we want to see. And we miss what's right in front of us. So here's the principle. The principle is the more you look, the more you see. Let me go over that again. So the more you look, the more you see. In fact, let me just type that in. Somebody can use this chat. The more you look, the more you see. Oops. I don't have my desk set up right. Okay. So, turn. And we'll put that up. The more you look, the more you see. The more you look, the more you see. The more you look, the more you see. Or, to quote Holmes again, he made the statement, you see, but you do not observe. Right? Observing is about being observant. Think about an observatory. They're observing the stars. And they look and look and look and look. And the more they look, the more they see, right? That is actually the way this works. The more you look, the more you see. There's a famous story. You can look it up. It's the parable of the sunfish. Ezra Pound wrote it forever ago based on a story of Professor Agassiz at Harvard. And it was involved a fish, a sunfish or Himalayan. I think I've read some versions. It seems like they had other types of fish. But it was all the story about a student who was, by his professor, invited to write up observations on this fish. And he worked one afternoon, wrote up a few, and gave them to the professor and said, no, there's more. And he kept bringing more, and he said, no, there's more. And after about 3 weeks, he came back with a really long paper and a really worn out fish from observing things about it that made him famous. In fact, if I remember the story correct, that student became famous fishologist or whatever it would be because of the power of observation. And the more you observe, the more data and information you have. The more you teach your kids to observe, the more they have to work with instead of just passing by and throwing out some theory. I personally went through this training in a really powerful way when I was in seminary in my master's program. And so we went into a class and we were given the assignment of observing, making observations from a passage. It was like Acts 1:8. And so we were to have 30 observations, so different things we noticed in the passage. And so we came in the next week, or the next class, and to hand them in, he said, no, I don't want them yet. I want 30 more. So going up to 60. And it about killed us to get the 30. And so by the time you get to 60 or more, you're exhausted on observations. And then we find out the record for that class was like 300 or something crazy. Really? There's that much in there? And the answer is yes, there is. So when we teach our children how to observe in all the areas of life, being more observant, grocery store, playground, um, literature, math, science, friendships, relationships, etc. A lot of life is about learning to be really observant. And so that's really the game. But it's a skill to develop. Maybe some people have a natural bent, but probably not so much as people who are trained and encouraged to develop it. I know it began to affect me because I started getting much more observant about what was around me. I have good friends in the military who are, when we go sit at coffee, they like to sit with their back to the wall and observe everything. We've had a few moments they thought something bad was fixing to go down because they're trained to observe dangerous situations. This friend I'm thinking of in particular was trained to do that very thing. So when you think about this, I want to give you a couple of examples and then an application of what to do. And don't be afraid to type in questions about this subject, really about anything. I'd be happy to give my thoughts about it. But this issue of observation, teaching our children to be observant. I just recently this week actually put a new section in our reading comprehension course, our mastering reading course. And the section has some templates where there are 3 aspects of how humans understand things. And so it's a training for, a couple of weeks on one aspect, then another, then another. And I was using A Christmas Carol to do it. So I'm using passages and some things in there to show how to look for details, how they fit together, how they move through time, that whole process that we've developed. And as I'm looking at it, I noticed something popped in my head. Having read it and seen the play and all kinds of stuff, read the book to the kids. But it's in the beginning. So Scrooge, remember, is stingy, he's tight, he don't want to do anything with the outside. His office is cold. Bob Cratchit is trying to warm himself in front of a candle, but doesn't have any imagination, so that doesn't work well. He can't get more coal because he has to go in Scrooge's office to get it, and he doesn't want to go through that. So it's this curmudgeon, stingy Scrooge, right? And his nephew comes in and greets his uncle, and his opening line is something like, it's meant as a greeting, but I realize Dickens is up to something. He says, "God save you, uncle." Well, that's at the beginning. And then by the end, Scrooge has been saved from his stinginess to become the most generous man going, right? I don't know why the name Scrooge doesn't mean generous. It should if you follow the story. But I didn't notice that. I haven't observed it until now this time through, and I realized, gosh, this whole story hangs together where there's this foreshadowing with the nephew, and then actually he is delivered from his lack of generosity, his miserly ways. So the more you look, right, the more you see. That's how this game goes. So the other thing, as I was thinking about, is like math and science. And some famous examples. One is Newton. I was reading this morning and someone described you remember the apple fell on Newton's head and he figured out gravity? And he says, this myth, blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, if you study it, it's not a myth. It may not have exactly happened, hit him on the head, and he goes, oh, gravity. But he told the story on several occasions about thinking about the apple and its falling and how that became not exactly an inspiration, maybe that's the way to say it, but it became something that really sparked in his mind a way to put together the nature of how gravity works and bodies being attracted by this force to each other. So there, and this was a thing with Newton, he was incredibly observant. He didn't like to impose a theory if he could avoid it, and he just noticed what was there and noticed more and noticed more. And it's part of what fed into his incredible brilliance. A brilliance where we use basically his formula still from 300 years ago to launch the space shuttle into orbit. That's crazy because of observation at the fundamental level. Another would be Einstein. So Einstein had observed human nature and people, and that played into some of his thought experiments. And part of his theory of relativity is he imagined, I'm not going to be perfect on this, close enough. He imagined riding on a beam of light at the speed of light. So he's going off, into forever on this beam of light in his mind. And then he imagines looking over to his side at a mirror that's traveling the same speed. And the question was, would he see himself in the mirror? And the idea in physics at the time was the answer would be no, because by the time the light for you to see went to the mirror and back, you'd be moving ahead. And so the reflection would shoot behind you. You wouldn't see yourself in a mirror. That's what they were saying. But in his observation and way of thinking it, he just said, everybody sees himself when they look in the mirror. I think I would. And that's the relative nature of something slowing down. This relativity theory that he developed was born from that combination, partly imagination, but also still there's this observing of human nature and being able to just notice things. That's kind of the game. Look, if you have any questions about this or anything, type them in now, because I'm going to talk about application and then whatever you'd like to talk about. So application. Application is, what do we do with this? It's a question we ask that goes like this. So what? What does it matter? What does it matter if we teach them how to observe? Well, it's going to make them better readers and better scientists, better friends, for sure. It's even going to help them when they're in public situations to be safer because they're observing what's going on. It's going to allow them to not bump into people because they're going to be observant about what's happening. They're going to be able to think through goals and objectives and processes. They're going to observe professors in schools or educators of some types or bosses and understand how they kind of work. And once you can be observant, you can function way better with a person. I remember with my dad, there were things I wanted to talk to him about that were serious, and I discovered my dad, after a number of things were in play, but especially after a day of work, etc., he really wasn't that good at talking about things. He just wanted to come home, relax, not think about law and problems or anything. So I started making appointments to drop by. Late morning I found was better, about 11 o'clock, a little before lunch. And then I could go talk to him about something serious I want to talk about. Now, that just came out of observation, and it helped our relationship a lot. Maybe he should be different, but who had time for that? So look, in applying this, I want to give you a couple of examples of what you can do, okay? One is a thing we did with our kids. One time we were at the beach for an extended vacation, and it was very stormy for a day or two, so they couldn't go outside anyway. So they're watching shows and reading books and whatever we had doing. And I went out. I was walking on the beach in one of the breaks in the rain, and I found a little jellyfish, a little perfectly formed, very small jellyfish had washed up on the beach. And I somehow got it in something, and I put it in a glass of water or seawater, and it suspended and floated very nicely in there. It wasn't alive, but it floated. And I had the kids sit down and draw a picture of it and make observations, because drawing it makes you have to look. What artists do, the great thing that artists do is they just see what's actually there. You have to kind of get trained to do that. They're great at observation. Great writers are that way too. They observe stuff and they tell you the truth. So we had them spend time and then share with each other that process. And I explained this very principle of, you want to work on learning to observe, because the more you look, the more you see. And so they could see the number of tentacles and how some were longer than others, and what the shape of the bell part was, and what was underneath, and how much space it took up, and. Because the more they looked, the more they saw. It's a skill. What you can do, you can do that. You can take something, get everybody to draw it. I think that's a great game plan. The other thing you can do is take a passage and play, I guess I'd call it the passage observation game, right? The passage observation game. And I picked out an old copy of ours. This is funny. The back came off and it got glued on backwards. So this is something called Alice in Wonderland. And Alice in Wonderland goes like this, the opening. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So she was considering in her own mind, as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. Okay, that's the introduction to the book. So the observation game is simply getting the kids to say, what do you notice? Get them to all understand it. You can read it again, make them copies, share it. So I can notice it's Alice and her sister, right? They're sitting by each other in a bank. I assume it's a river bank, right? So I've got Alice and her sister sitting by each other. And then Alice was getting tired of sitting. She wasn't getting tired, but later I noticed she was getting sleepy because of the heat. But she was tired of sitting by her sister. The book didn't interest her. But I noticed it wasn't that she was tired of sitting. It was she was beginning to get tired of sitting. And that's different. It's starting to wear on her. It's the beginning. And of having nothing to do. So in her mind, she had nothing to do, though there's plenty to do. But in her mind, sitting is not doing. Daisy chain would be sitting. You know, that's her option. One option is a daisy chain, if it'd be worth it. Another option would be to be interested in the sister's book. But I noticed, too, the book had no pictures or conversations. I don't know what the book was, but it didn't have dialogue in it. It didn't have pictures in it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice. So I can observe Alice as a certain way to look at books, that books are there somehow to, what would you say, entertain her, to engage her. No purpose in books to convey information or whatever, but more what we'd call imaginative literature, what this book, Alice in Wonderland, is going to be about. She was considering in her own mind, so I'm observing in her mind she's considering, so she's going back and forth with something. And this was as well as she could, so she wasn't thinking very clearly, kind of in a daze, observation. Whether, and now it's not make something to do, daisy chain, but the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble. So I can observe Alice is weighing how much pleasure would I get from how much work the daisy chain would be. So gathering the daisies, not pleasurable, making the chain pleasurable. So she has this contrast between what she'd find pleasurable and what would not be pleasurable. Be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. So it doesn't say ran by the sister, so it sounds like it was on Alice's side. It may have been by both of them, but I'm just saying what's here. And it's a white rabbit, it's pink eyes, and it's running. It's not hopping, it's not walking, but it's running. And it doesn't describe on 2s or 4s, but we can guess. So I just went through that and made some observations. I could still make more. So let's see if I can pull out something. I didn't notice it made her sleepy and stupid. So she wasn't thinking clearly, and she was sleepy, right? But she was weighing a decision in her mind. So it creates a picture of a kind of a groggy state. And then by implication, the suddenly a white rabbit sounds to me like it woke her up, you know, so something interesting, something engaging, which was neither a book, nor daisies, nor conversation, nor pictures, right? Though ultimately in the story it works out that it did very much lead to the book about is lots and lots about conversations and very imaginative pictures, right? So that's the idea, that you just keep observing more and more and then more and more of the same thing. When you think you've got it all figured out, you are mistaken. You still have more to go. So I'm suggesting let's teach our kids to observe. You can do it driving down the road. You can create games looking out the window. You can do it with passages, as I just said. Math problems require this. Taking a math problem and not solving it, just observe more and more. Get them to observe all they can in it. How many trains, which direction, what's the speed, what's this say? Just all they can observe, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. By the time they get through that, I almost guarantee you, if it's appropriate to their math skills, they'll be able to figure that out. So that's my thought for this little live stream. Let's teach our kids to observe. So I'll give it a second, see if anything pops up. I know there's a delay in this system. If you have a question, now's the time. I will end with this story, and there may be a question pops up. A friend of mine who I've known for some years, who I stay in touch with, is a executive, been executives on boards in the oil and gas industry as an engineer. And one time he told me, he said, you know, the most important thing you taught me, or one of the most, and I had a role in teaching back then, and him in particular and others. But he said, what you taught me was this thing about observation, interpretation, correlation, application. So it's a little process, but the main one was observation. And when you taught me how to do that, I went back and taught my engineers that worked for me how to do it. And it transformed us as a team. Our ability to not come up with a theory, not come up with a way to solve the problem, but to spend more time up front just observing what the issues were with the mechanical, oil and gas, drilling, production, whatever it was. Because they discovered the more you look, the more you see. And he said, throughout my career, I've continued to teach people to do this, and it makes a dramatic difference in how well they function together as a team and as individuals. And I'm going to tell you that for you, your child is going to be blessed. Maybe it will grow up and thank you if you will teach them to observe. Teach them specifically that the more you look, the more you see. Hope you have a great day.